Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Humanities Forum this week. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here and the Humanities program, and the director of the Humanities Forum. The Humanities Forum exists to provide a regular space most Fridays during the semester when the entire campus community is invited to think about some of the deepest human things. One of the things we do regularly is try to tie our events to the DWC periodization schedule. So it's our hope that some of you, perhaps many of you, are right now thinking about Shakespeare in your own classes and are here with all of us together to think about him as a group today. We have a very special event today that's a combination both of a distinguished guest and some of our guests from on campus. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium Aaron Schmidt, who's a colleague of mine in the Theater, Dance, and Film department.
Thank you so much, Raymond. It's wonderful to see so many of you here on a Friday afternoon. As Jim just pointed out, it's great to see all of your faces. This is a day that we've been looking forward to for a while now. And before I introduce Dr. Shapiro, I just want to say that we will have a couple of Providence College students involved in the presentation. So thank you to Rodney Lopez and Annalisa Pisano, who will be reciting some text from Shakespeare's Macbeth. I do. Yes to them. James Shapiro is the Larry Miller Professor of English at Columbia University, where he has taught since 1985. Among his books are 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, which won the Samuel Johnson Prize, Contested Will, The Year of Lear, the winner of the James Tait Black Prize for Biography, and most recently, and what Dr. Shapiro will be speaking on today, Shakespeare in a Divided America, which was selected one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times. Dr. Shapiro's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, among many others. He has been awarded Guggenheim, Cullman, and NEH fellowships, and in 2011 was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Currently, Dr. Shapiro is serving as a judge for the Booker Prize. He has served on the board of directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and the Authors Guild. And what is most exciting to me as a theater practitioner, Dr. Shapiro is currently a Shakespeare scholar in residence at the Public Theater in New York. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Shapiro.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to begin by turning things over to Vincent, and student actors are going to frame this presentation and one-up me in so doing. Go ahead, Vincent.
But a walking shadow, the poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. Oh, I am pity, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
Oh, great, thank you. Can you hear me in the back? I'm mic'd up, so I can never tell. If I fade, just do that universal sign for we can no longer hear you. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really amazed and grateful on a Friday afternoon at this point in the semester that so many of you are here to hear me speak. I'm going to speak for 40 minutes and then open it up to any and all questions. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there is going to be a reception after. The title of my talk today is Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, and Macbeth. On April 26, 1865, 12 days after he assassinated Abraham Lincoln, the fugitive John Wilkes Booth was caught and killed by Union soldiers. A letter was found in his possession addressed to Dr. Richard Stewart, a Confederate sympathizer. Booth had written it 2 days earlier, hobbled by a broken ankle, running out of cash, and demoralized by how even Southern newspapers were vilifying him for murdering Lincoln. Booth arrived at Stewart's house in King George County, Virginia, along with 3 companions, late in the afternoon of April 23rd, Shakespeare's birthday, having been directed there by Confederate agents. But Stewart refused to treat Booth's injury, denied the men shelter, and only grudgingly provided a meal before sending them on their way. Booth saw in Stewart's chilly reception a mirror of how his act was being received in the South. Though he knew that his capture or death was imminent, Booth paused to draft this biting letter before sending a slightly revised copy of it in which the money he enclosed with it was halved. This is the letter. I was sick and tired with a broken leg in need of medical advice. I would not have turned a dog from my door in such a condition. However, you were kind enough to give me something to eat, for which I not only thank you, but on account of the reluctant manner in which it was bestowed, I feel bound to pay for it. It is not the substance, but the manner in which kindness is extended that makes one happy in the acceptance thereof. The sauce is meat to ceremony, meeting or bear without it. Be kind enough to accept the envelope, $2.50, though hard to spare, for what we have received. The letter is clear enough until its next to last sentence, which is lifted from the scene in Macbeth, in which Lady Macbeth upbraids her husband for his lack of hospitality. I'll read her speech. My royal lord, you do not give the cheer. The feast is sold that is not often vouched while 'tis a-making. 'Tis given with welcome to feed or best at home. From thence the sauce is meat to ceremony, meeting or bear without it. Now this happens to be one of the most impenetrable speeches in Shakespeare. I've read it for the 500th time and still don't know what it means as I am reading it. And it's so dense that Booth has to supply his own paraphrase in the preceding sentence. Shamed by how Stewart had treated him, Booth offers a Shakespearean rebuke, yet the words themselves are a rebuke of an assassin. Pride, self-justification, self-doubt, and suppressed guilt commingle in this complicated illusion. That Booth's thoughts kept returning to Shakespeare during these desperate days is evident from another one of his diary entries written soon after he shot Lincoln, this one invoking Julius Caesar. I'll quote, after being hunted like a dog through swamps, woods, with every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for. That same diary entry closes with another quotation from Macbeth, one that valorizes courage in the face of inevitable defeat. I do not wish to shed a drop of blood, but I must fight the course. Shakespeare's Macbeth, hemmed in by his enemies, had said, they have tied me to a stake, I cannot fly, but bear like, I must fight the course. Booth here likens himself to a doomed Shakespearean hero fighting against the odds, a role that had been the hallmark of his brief theatrical career. He had played Macbeth over 30 times, after Richard III, his most frequent role, on a couple of occasions staging the only part of the play he was really keen on, the crowd-pleasing final scene, which in Booth's version ended with a realistic fight to the death. He was really an athletic Macbeth, and when meeting with the witches, he would stand upon a ledge of rock some 10 or 12 feet high, from which he would leap down. And he would employ a version of this stage trick a final time after shooting Lincoln, leaping from the presidential box of Ford's Theater onto the stage, where he reportedly cried, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always with tyrants, before rushing out through the back of the theater. It's no small irony that the man he had murdered had seen him act and knew Shakespeare's plays as intimately as Booth did. Abraham Lincoln did not have much formal education. His father was illiterate. His mother could read, but not write. Lincoln was born in 1809 and spent his first 7 years in Kentucky before his family moved west to Indiana, where they cleared a plot of land and built a one-room log cabin in which Lincoln would live for the next 14 years. His mother fell ill and died 2 years after the move, and a year after that, his father remarried. Lincoln's stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, remembered young Abe as diligent for knowledge, a boy who read all the books he could lay his hands on, including the handful she had brought with her. Throughout his life, Lincoln preferred poetry to prose, old writing to new, and only slightly exaggerated when he confessed, "I've never read an entire novel in my life." His most revealing comments about his interest in Shakespeare appear in a letter to the actor James Hackett in 1863, in which Lincoln wrote, "Some of Shakespeare's plays I've never read, while others I've gone over perhaps as frequently as any unprofessional reader." He goes on to list the plays to which he kept returning: Lear, Richard III, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and especially Macbeth. Lincoln had encountered all of them, except for Macbeth, in an anthology that his stepmother had brought with her when she joined his family, and which was likely his introduction to Shakespeare. William Scott's popular Lessons in Elocution. In Scott's collection of famous speeches, Shakespeare's plays figure largely. 33 of them are excerpted. Some of the passages Lincoln first encountered in this volume almost seem tattooed inside his skull and would long remain at the center of his imaginative and emotional worlds. Hamlet offers a good case in point. Lessons in Elocution printed on facing pages the most famous soliloquy in the language, Hamlet's "to be or not to be," and with it, the one later spoken in the play by Claudius when he's tortured by guilt over having killed his brother and seized his brother's wife and crown. Defying convention, Lincoln thought Claudius' speech was lots better than Hamlet's, and he wasn't afraid to say so. It was a topic Lincoln warmed to in March of 1864, right before going to see Edwin Booth, John Wilkes' brother, play Hamlet. He spoke about Shakespeare that day with Francis Carpenter, a portrait painter who shadowed him for 4 months in the White House. And he told Carpenter that Claudius' soliloquy had always struck him as one of the finest touches of nature in the world. And to underscore this point, Lincoln threw himself, Carpenter writes, into the very spirit of the scene and began reciting, "Oh, my offense is rank, it smells to heaven, it has the primal eldest cursed upon it, a brother's murder. Pray can I not, though inclination be as sharp as will, my stronger guilt defeats my strong intent." Claudius's self-recrimination continues for another 35 lines, which I'll spare you, but Lincoln did not spare Carpenter. What interested Lincoln in Shakespeare absorbed him deeply. I could give you many examples, but one in particular stands out from early on in his presidency, May 1862, when the war was going badly in the North and Lincoln was mourning the recent death of his beloved son, Willie. Lincoln traveled to Fort Monroe to consult there with commanders, and once there he found himself needing to read Shakespeare for distraction and comfort. The officers there, LeGrand B. Cannon, recalled how Lincoln borrowed his copy of Shakespeare's work, read from it for hours, then asked Cannon if he wouldn't mind if he recited aloud. Lincoln proceeded to read from Macbeth, then Lear, and then King John, the great passage beginning, grief fills the room up with my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, in which Constance bewails the loss of her child. Cannon records being struck by how deeply moved the president was. His voice trembled. Laying the book on the table, he said, "Did you ever dream of a lost friend and feel you were having a direct communion with that friend, and yet a consciousness that it was not a reality?" My reply, Cannon said, was, "Yes, I think we may all have had such an experience," to which Lincoln replied, "So do I dream of my boy, Willie." He was totally overcome. His great frame shook, and bowing down on the table, he wept, as only such a man in the breaking down of great sorrow could weep. In the histories and the tragedies that fascinated Lincoln, Shakespeare put his protagonists, most of them ambitious leaders, under unbearable pressure. Among the most powerful moments in these plays are the speeches in which characters confront moral dilemmas and give voice to the guilt and the grief that crushes them. That these characters were often evil, Richard III, Macbeth, Claudius, didn't matter to Lincoln. What did was the degree of self-awareness, how fully they understood the difficult choices that they faced. John Wilkes Booth's early exposure to Shakespeare could not have been more different. This was because his father was Junius Brutus Booth, one of England's leading Shakespeare actors by the age of 21. A few years later, accompanied by a lover, Mary Ann Holmes, he sailed for America, where he quickly established himself as a touring star. Soon after his arrival, he purchased a farm in rural Harford County, Maryland, and he and Mary Ann had 10 children out of wedlock, 6 of whom survived. And the second youngest was John Wilkes Booth, who was born in 1838. John Wilkes' sister, Asia, with whom he was especially close, wrote a warm recollection of him, the source of most of what we know about John Wilkes' childhood. As a boy, she recalls, "He put on my long train dress and walked before the long glass, declaring that he would succeed as Lady Macbeth in the sleepwalking scene." It's an unusual role and a surprising choice of a scene for a child, even a precocious one, to aspire to master. His older brother, Edwin Booth, remembered him as a rattle-pated fellow filled with quixotic notions. While at the farm at Maryland, he would charge on horseback through the woods, spouting heroic speeches. Looking back, both his brother and sister saw the child as father to the man. John Wilkes' identity seems to have been fixed at a young age, and as Asia put it, did not change much as he matured, only his opinions and principles became more riveted. By his teenage years, John Wilkes was already developing a keen sense, not only for him of the superiority of whites over blacks, but also of bosses over their workers. Even as a teenager, he had, as she put it, that Southern reservation which jealously kept the white laborer from free association with his employer or his superior. As a result, she writes, "We were not a popular family with our white laborers." And these views were reinforced at clandestine know-nothing meetings that the teenage John Wilkes attended a few miles from their home. secret gatherings that stoked anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic hatred. Perhaps the most telling of Asia's recollections occurred after he chastised her for failing to forgive a neighbor. Alluding to Shylock, John Wilkes teasingly suggested that his sister must have some tinge of Jewish blood. He then added, "Much of the evil of us boys and girls, some of the good as well, must have been engendered by power of those furious plays our father enacts, the Shylocks, the Pescara, the mad-seeming Hamlet, lovesick Romeo." It's really an extraordinary thing for him to say. John Wilkes recognizes that the powerful moral influence that the plays at the center of their father's life, and by extension their own, had on the formation of their character, especially their propensity for evil. John Wilkes' immersion in Shakespeare deepened considerably once it was clear that the farm, which he had tried to run after his father's death, was failing, and that he would have to make a living as an actor. But unlike his older brothers, he didn't see his future out west or up north. According to Asia, he worked to make himself essentially a Southern actor. To that end, he applied himself studiously to Shakespeare, and she listened to him recite parts over and over again. Shakespeare was now work, a skill to be mastered, and John Wilkes committed himself to it. He was a perfectionist and would not allow a word or syllable to go wrong. And Julius Caesar, that test part for the theatrical scholar, was so constantly repeated, she writes, that even the little darkies, whose privilege was to sit and loll about in the corner, whatever rooms we occupied, were caught repeating them. She also remembers a time when a young slave girl recited the lines more accurately than John Wilkes, which provoked him to say, "Hark to that thick-skulled darky, she has sharper wits than I." He was an absolute white supremacist. Lincoln's compulsion to recite Shakespeare never slackened. He may not have craved adulation as Booth did, but he too needed an audience. Given his immersion in Shakespeare, one might expect that Lincoln would have littered his speeches and letters with quotations from the plays, as many politicians at the time did. But he was careful not to do so. And despite the best efforts of admirers to find echoes of Shakespeare in the Gettysburg Address or the first or second inaugural address, they're so faint as to be inaudible. Lincoln kept a firewall between Shakespeare's words and his own, assiduously avoiding the casual quotation of Shakespeare's phrases that marked the writing of so many, including Booth. One of those who frequently heard Lincoln and was something of a surrogate son, especially after Willie's death, was John Hay. And in the humid summer months in Washington, Hay would accompany Lincoln to the Soldiers' Home, 3 miles north of the White House, where they would work more comfortably. One evening, Hay recalled, Lincoln, quote, read Shakespeare to me, the end of Henry VI, the beginning of Richard III, till my heavy eyelids caught his considerate notice, and he sent me to bed, which is a polite way of saying Lincoln obsessively read Shakespeare to anybody who would listen a lot longer than anybody really wanted to hear him read. Hay helpfully recorded Lincoln's favorite. The plays he most affected were Hamlet, Macbeth, and the histories, and notes that when he heard him read from the Hollow Crown speech of Richard II, he was quite moved as Lincoln returned to these poignant words and how the meaning deepened for him over the years. So far as we know, until the last 2 years of his life, Abraham Lincoln had never seen Shakespeare performed. In his youth, he hadn't had many opportunities, and during his first 2 years in office, he tried to avoid the theater because of the demands of the war and really the optics of having somebody who had lost a son, Willie, during an extended period of mourning going to the theater. But from March 1863, when he first saw James Hackett's Falstaff, until the night he was shot in April 1865 during the performance of an English farce, Our American Cousin, where Booth knew where to find him. Lincoln became a devoted playgoer, witnessing along with other plays, most of his favorite Shakespeare ones, performed by the greatest stars of the day, whose company and conversation he sought out. As Carpenter and Hayes' accounts confirm, his playgoing over the last 2 years of his life didn't replace his readings. If anything, it intensified it, as Lincoln measured his own performance and interpretation against those of leading actors. Lincoln's belated playgoing was made possible by a pair of Washington playhouses that booked the leading Shakespeares of the day and that weren't far from the White House. Grover's Theater, just 3 blocks away, and Ford's Theater, a half-mile away. 4 decades after the assassination, Leonard Grover, who owned the Grover's Theater, claimed that the president had visited his theater more than 100 times, and that feels like something of an exaggeration. But even if he visited half that number, and roughly the same number at Ford's, that would work out to a show a week. And though John Wilkes Booth performed often in Washington, Lincoln only went to see him once at Ford's on November 9, 1863. He didn't like what he saw and didn't go back. Leading actors were invited to the White House, and Lincoln loved grilling them about what he thought were unconscionable changes to what Shakespeare had written. He asked James Hackett to justify why he had cut the scene in which Hal and Falstaff take turns playing King Henry IV, and was unconvinced by Hackett's explanation. It just didn't work on stage. This wasn't simple banter or curiosity. It mattered to Lincoln in a way that scriptural variant might matter to a believer. Lincoln understood that while in the White House he could criticize the actors' textual choices, but when he was on their turf, he was subject to their criticism of his political decisions. One of those who opposed his policies was the great American actor Edwin Forrest. Lincoln went to see him in a play called Richelieu, a modern play familiar to the president, who had seen it with Edwin Booth in the lead. The war was by this time almost over, a Union victory ever more assured, though the cost, as General Sherman continued his savage, scorched earth march through the South, was hard for many to stomach. A young actor, William Ferguson, was holding the prompt book that night. He later recalled the sentiment among stage folk during the war was sharply divided, and among those who strongly disapproved of the president's war policy was Edwin Forrest. Here's what he writes. I was standing at the prompt stand following the manuscript when Forrest came to the line, "Take away the sword, states may be saved without it." Turning to look directly at the president, he declaimed intensely, "Take away the sword, states must be saved without it." By the alteration of a single word, the tragedian was able to give voice to the bitterness of his own feelings. Now, a more thin-skinned president would not have taken so public a rebuke so kindly. Yet, Lincoln reportedly gave a patient smile to the glaring tragedian and returned to Ford's later that month to see Forrest perform again as King Lear, the last Shakespeare production he would live to see. A young French writer, Auguste Laguel, a friend of Charles Sumner, was invited to join Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, and their young son Tad, and Sumner to that performance. Laguel seems to have spent as much time watching Lincoln as he did the play, and his closely observed comments capture Lincoln's unshakable habit of measuring what he was hearing against Shakespeare's original, which he had pretty much by heart. Laudel also allows us a glimpse of what led Lincoln to watch the great actors of his day perform. The performance touched him deeply, spoke to the loss and the guilt that were nearly overwhelming the president. Laudel writes, his boy of 11 was beside him, and the father often clasped him very tenderly as the child leaned his head upon his shoulder. And when the little fellow, as he often did, asked for explanations, Lincoln invariably made answer, "My child, it's in the play." Laguel also saw how certain allusions made by King Lear to parental grief brought a cloud over the president's forehead. The 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday, April 23, 1864, fell shortly before the Battle of the Wilderness, where Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee would square off in a grinding war of attrition. In New York City, plans for the anniversary celebration centered on laying a cornerstone for the statue of Shakespeare that now stands at the south end of the Mall of Central Park. Actors, not writers, took the lead, offering benefit performances that helped to pay for that statue. Edwin Booth may have hoped that his brothers Junius and John Wilkes, who had finished an engagement in New Orleans and was on his way to Boston, would join him for that benefit performance. But Edwin had to act without them that night. He next tried enlisting his brothers for a follow-up benefit in July, but a planned performance of Julius Caesar did not take place because John Wilkes didn't show up. It wasn't until November 25th, 1864, that the three Booth brothers, all stars, shared the stage for the first and only time in a benefit performance of Julius Caesar at the Winter Garden. Edwin was Brutus, Junius was Cassius, and John Wilkes was cast as Antony. The repeated delays sharpened the topical edge of the play now that Lincoln had been reelected in early November, an outcome that had been in doubt the previous summer. Lincoln's enemies were now accusing him of aspiring to be president for life, and Edwin recalled arguing with his brother over John Wilkes' belief that Lincoln would be king of America. Lincoln's exercise of his executive powers was viewed by his opponents as tyrannical in its trampling of congressional authority and the rights enshrined within the Constitution. As early as 1861, and calling up the militia and blockading southern ports after Fort Sumter was fired upon, Lincoln was attacked for declaring war without securing congressional approval. And his critics argued that in allowing the military to arrest civilians, he had suspended habeas corpus. Lincoln's administration, potentially infringing on First Amendment rights, also closed over 300 opposition newspapers. Lincoln was also accused of abusing his powers by demanding that the Confederacy remain within the Union, subjecting free people even as he emancipated enslaved ones. All these charges cut to the heart of basic rights and freedoms of American citizens, included who counted as one. For the Booth brothers to stage Julius Caesar in the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's reelection inevitably foregrounded the issue of how defenders of liberty should best respond. Now, between the initial plans for a joint performance and staging of Julius Caesar in November of 1864, John Wilkes Booth had become radicalized. In October, a month before he performed in Julius Caesar, he'd gone up to Montreal, where he consulted with Confederate officials and received money to help cover the cost of a plot he was devising, in which he and his fellow conspirators would kidnap the president while he was riding with a small guard in Washington Street, or subdue and bind him when he was seeing a play at Ford's Theater. And this kidnapping was to take place in late January. Booth was not the only desperate supporter of the Confederacy undertaking violent acts long considered beyond the pale. A group of Confederate agents lit multiple phosphorus fires through New York City the very evening that the Booth brothers were performing Julius Caesar. And it was a near thing that the theater in which they were playing was not burned down. The New York Times called it one of the most fiendish and inhuman acts in modern times. And that date might have been recorded as the greatest theatrical disaster, although Lincoln might have survived. After the November benefit, Booth focused his energies on kidnapping or killing Lincoln. He spent his days drinking, pursuing women, meeting with Confederates to establish escape routes between Washington and Virginia, and practicing shooting with Lincoln as his target. While plans to kidnap the president were still in the works, Booth went to hear Lincoln deliver his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865. Lincoln didn't flinch from placing responsibility for the costly war on the Confederacy, saying both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. Photographs of that event showed John Wilkes Booth standing above and to the left of Lincoln listening to that address. Now, Booth's amateurish plot to kidnap Lincoln began unraveling, and by April, with the fall of Richmond to Union troops, it had been abandoned, and most of his accomplices quietly slipped away. The script was hurriedly rewritten. The plot now turned on killing the president and others. On April 11th, Booth went to the White House to hear Lincoln give an address promising limited suffrage for black men. Booth declared afterwards that this was the last speech Lincoln would ever make. The next day, he visited Ford's Theater and told Henry Clay Ford, "We're all slaves now. If a man were to go out and insult a Negro, he'd be knocked down by the Negro, and nothing would be done to that Negro." The ticket seller, Tom Raybould, was listening and told Booth, "Then don't insult one then." I'll not repeat the ugly slur Booth used instead of the word Negro. 2 days later, on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, Booth urged clerks at a local hotel, "Go see the play at Ford's that evening. There's going to be some splendid acting tonight." We'll never know to what extent performing in Julius Caesar for the first and only time in his life catalyzed John Wilkes Booth's violent intentions. Before shooting the president, he wrote a long letter defending his actions, one that he expected to have published in a newspaper called the National Intelligencer. On the day of his assassination, he gave that letter to a fellow actor, John Matthews, asking Matthews to deliver it. But Matthews, terrified of being punished as an accomplice after hearing that Booth had shot Lincoln, read it, memorized it, then burned that letter. Many years later, his reconstructed version of it was published. In it, Booth appeals to the precedent of Shakespeare's Brutus, and I quote, "When Caesar had conquered the enemies of Rome and the power that was his menaced the liberties of the people, Brutus arose and slew him. The stroke of his dagger was guided by his love of Rome. It was the spirit and ambition of Caesar that Brutus struck at." And Booth ends the letter quoting from Shakespeare's play, "Oh, that we could come by Caesar's spirit and not dismember Caesar, but alas, Caesar must bleed for it." As much as in his final months, John Wilkes Booth tried to portray himself as an American Brutus, the role suited him, as Shakespeare put it in Macbeth, like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. In the course of his career, Booth performed a surprisingly narrow range of Shakespearean roles, even for a touring star dependent on the repertory of resident companies in towns across the land. Rather than playing introspective or noble parts, as his father and his elder brother did, the only Shakespeare roles in which he distinguished himself were dark and often villainous heroes, men of action who die fighting. By the time that Union troops from New York's 16th Cavalry trapped him in a barn on April 26, 1865, Booth had spent years rehearsing what would be his final scene. He understood exits as well as anyone and desperately wanted to make one befitting a tragic and heroic figure. To his chagrin, the soldiers had no inclination to play along. Trapped in a barn and surrounded, Booth begged unsuccessfully for a chance to die fighting, as he had so often done as Macbeth and Richard III. "Give me a chance for my life," he shouted, "and I'll come out and fight you." One of the soldiers then fired into the barn, clipped Booth in the spinal cord, paralyzing him. Booth was denied the chance to die heroically. His final words, after realizing he couldn't even raise his hands, were, "Useless, useless." Abraham Lincoln spent April 9th, 1865, 5 days before he was assassinated, aboard the steamboat River Queen, sailing back to Washington after a risky visit to the front, including a tour of the now liberated capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, where fires were still burning. Lightly guarded and accompanied by his son Tad as he entered Richmond, Lincoln was mobbed by newly freed slaves. Lincoln then proceeded to what was called the Confederate White House and sat in the office of Jefferson Davis, who had fled the city. It was a gesture that sat poorly with those embittered by its symbolism. John Wilkes Booth was maddened by it, having heard rumors that Lincoln had spat tobacco juice while lounging in Davis' chair. Though Lincoln did not yet know it, as he was sailing back to Washington, Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, all but bringing the war to an end. One of those who journeyed home with him on the River Queen was Senator Charles Sumner, who recalled how Lincoln's thoughts once again turned to Shakespeare and to Macbeth in particular, as the president pulled out a handsome quarto of the play he had brought along with him and twice read aloud the tribute to the murdered Duncan. Sumner was accompanied by a young Frenchman, the Marquis de Chambrun, whose diary entry for that day offers a fuller version of what took place. Mr. Lincoln read to us for several hours passages taken from Shakespeare. Many of these were from Macbeth, and in particular, the verses which follow Duncan's assassination. I cannot recall this reading without being awed at the remembrance when Macbeth became king after the murder of Duncan. He fell a prey to the most horrible torments of mind. In his usual way, Lincoln paused here while reading and began to explain to us how true a description of the murderer that one was. When the dark deed achieved, its tortured perpetrator came to envy the sleep of his victim. And he read over again the same scene. Methought I heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep. The innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast. Still it cried, sleep no more to all the house. Glamis had murdered sleep, and therefore quarter shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." A more arrogant leader might well have quoted Malcolm's victorious lines at play's end, having triumphed on the battlefield. "And what needful else that calls upon us by the grace of grace, we will perform in measured time and place." But Lincoln chose instead to dwell upon how perfectly Shakespeare captured the unrelieved guilt of the tortured perpetrator. It's not surprising that Lincoln had brought along a copy of Macbeth. He told Charlotte Cushman, the greatest Lady Macbeth of his day, it was his favorite play. And in his letter to James Hackett had written, "I think nothing equals Macbeth. I think it is wonderful." Lincoln seems to have found comfort reciting from this dark tragedy. That, at least, was the impression of John Forney, editor of the Philadelphia Press, who writes, "Lincoln had his periods of depression. And one evening I found him in such a mood. He was ghastly pale. The dark rings were round his caverned eyes. His hair was brushed back from his temples, and he was reading that speech that you so beautifully led us off with." I cannot read it like Forrest, Lincoln added, but it comes to me tonight like a consolation. If any American reader of Shakespeare has truly felt, through meditating on the tormented words of guilt-ridden characters like Macbeth, the deep connection between the nation's own primal sin, slavery, and the terrible cost, both collective and personal, exacted by it, it was Lincoln. There was another reason he might have been brooding about Macbeth on that trip to Richmond. Lincoln's friend and self-appointed bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, recalled that a few days before he was assassinated, an unusually melancholy Lincoln had told a small group, including Lehman and Lincoln's wife, about a nightmare he had had 10 days earlier while awaiting important dispatches from the front. It was a dream, Lincoln said, that had haunted him ever since. Lincoln was loath to mention this disturbing premonition to his wife, but his compulsion to share it was too great. Likening himself to a Macbeth rattled by visions, Lincoln said that somehow the thing has got possession of me and like Banquo's ghost will not down. In the dream, which calls to mind what Shakespeare calls the slumbery agitation of a guilt-stricken, sleepwalking Lady Macbeth, Lincoln remembers leaving his bed and wandering downstairs. He saw himself entering the East Room of the White House, where he was met with a sickening surprise. A corpse, guarded by soldiers and surrounded by a throng of mourners, some weeping pitifully. When Lincoln, in his dream, asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" a soldier replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." A loud burst of grief from the mourners woke Lincoln from his nightmare. The experience was so unnerving that for the rest of the night, Lincoln said he slept no more. Layman, who writes that he jotted down at the time what Lincoln had said as nearly in his own words as he could recall, adds that Lincoln was profoundly disturbed by this nightmare and continued to dwell on it. In conversations with me, he referred to it afterwards, closing with this quotation from Hamlet, "To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub," with a strong accent on the last three words. To conclude, the assassination marked a beginning as much as an end, of reconstruction, of the lost cause, of a battle for equality for the freed slaves and their descendants, and of the struggle to define the legacies of both Lincoln and Booth, in which Shakespeare unsurprisingly figured. Some of those who knew John Wilkes Booth well saw Shakespeare's hand behind his act. In 1878, the theater manager, John Ford, told a journalist that, quote, "John Wilkes Booth was trained from earliest infancy, considered the almost deified assassin Brutus, just as Shakespeare immortalized him. Ford imagined Booth thinking, 'If I failed to serve the South in my conspiracy to abduct, I can now be her Brutus.' Booth's mind, Ford believed, was turned by the poetic and dramatic glamour which transmitted the story of the Roman assassination. 36 years after Booth shot Lincoln, when it was safer to say such things, Edward M. Alfrand, who had been friends with Booth, writes, "If the truth be known, John Wilkes Booth, in his insanity, lost his identity in the delirious fantasy that he was enacting the role of Brutus, that Lincoln was his Caesar." Efforts to recast the assassination of Lincoln as a reenactment of Julius Caesar found little purchase among the vast majority of Americans, even in the defeated South. The play that the nation settled on to give voice to what happened and define how Lincoln was to be remembered turned out to be Macbeth, especially the passage likening him to the slain Duncan, who hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. These 4 lines from Macbeth were repeatedly recited in eulogies. They were strung on banners on storefronts and formed the centerpiece of a black border funeral broadside that circulated Shakespeare applied to our national bereavement. To mourn Lincoln as another Duncan was to move away from Booth's violent and self-destructive understanding of Macbeth, as well as to edge away from Lincoln's introspective one. True, the play was about an assassination, but unlike that in Julius Caesar, it was an act that was driven by ambition, not ideology. So, better suited to the story America preferred to tell itself now that the war was over, but what was to follow was unclear. Some wanted to celebrate Lincoln as a radical who gave his life to free the slaves. Others wanted to memorialize him as a moderate who fought to save the Union and whose death was a setback to Reconstruction and the reconciliation of North and South. Likening Lincoln to Duncan papered over the considerable gap between these two positions. For Duncan was something of a cipher in Macbeth. He may be the only ruler in all of Shakespeare's plays whose limitations are overlooked, one of those rare instances where Shakespeare did not build on the hints provided in his source material, Holinshed's Chronicles. In aspiring to die like Macbeth, though not to reflect on his crime as Macbeth himself had done, John Wilkes Booth had failed to anticipate that the man he cold-bloodedly murdered would be revered like Duncan, his faults forgotten. And for a divided America, the universal currency of Shakespeare's words offered a collective catharsis once the story of Lincoln's assassination was successfully recast as a national tragedy of Shakespearean dimensions, permitting a blood-soaked and tentatively reunited country to yet again put off confronting what Booth declared had driven him to act, the conviction that America, in Booth's words, was formed for the white and not the black man. Thank you. Here's the scene that haunted Lincoln in his dreams. That was great, and I think Lincoln would have appreciated that as well. I certainly did. We have time for Q&A, and here are the ground rules. Ask anything you like. I'll try to be as honest as I can, and if I have to equivocate, I will.
Yes, and just so you know, it is the custom of the forum that we start off with a student question, and I'll come around to you with the microphone so that we make sure it gets recorded. So just raise your hand and I'll.
And it doesn't have to be about the talk. It could be about Shakespeare or about the humanities or about anything that you feel like asking me that I can answer in mixed company. This is your chance.
Yes.
Other than who I want in the final four. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Maisie. So you touched on how, there's all these theories about how John Wilkes Booth's experience with Shakespeare informed what he did. But like in a larger context, I guess, Shakespeare really humanizes his villains. What effect do you think that has for someone who's not just John Wilkes Booth?
That's a great, great, great question. And obviously for Lincoln, Shakespeare humanized his villains because Lincoln identified with those villains more than he identified with his heroes. For me, part of the story that's connected with your question is how differently people read these plays. When I sat in ninth grade and hated Shakespeare, my teacher would tell me, this is what the plays are about. And I always resisted that because it never kind of dovetailed with what I was experiencing. So what's so fascinating to me is how badly, from my perspective, John Wilkes Booth read these plays. And in a way, Lincoln was a bad reader too, but we kind of like Lincoln, so we like his readings, and we don't like Booth, so we don't like the readings of, a racist nationalist. But the truth is, each of us read Shakespeare through the prism of our own experience. And one of the great things about teaching Shakespeare in a classroom for over 40 years now is the experience of my students keeps changing. When I taught the parents of kids who are now in my class, and I have done that more than a few times, when we'd come to Julius Caesar, I'd ask, who identifies with Brutus? And most hands in the class in these post-1968 radical days shot up. Now when I say who identifies with Brutus, my kids say, you gotta be kidding me. The guy is deluded. He has no idea what's going on. He's a pointy-headed academic. Looks what happens after he kills Caesar. So there's both generational change and there's really such a difference in how those from different socioeconomic and ethnic and racial and age groups read and experience these plays. And one of the things that I get to do that was happily left out of my introduction was I go with actors into prison where Shakespeare is performed by terrific equity actors from New York City, desperate for work, and to a captive audience, we might say. And no cell phones ever go off because none are allowed at Rikers Island. And their experience of the plays is radically different than mine. In fact, is much closer to an Elizabethan response to a Shakespeare play than to one that has been acculturated in classrooms. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but it opened up a lot of issues. Let me take another undergraduate question in the back,
sure.
in the center.
Hi, my name is Mason. you mentioned like the whole thing about Lincoln just going and kind of reciting a lot of passages from Macbeth specifically. And I just could not help but think about the fact that I've had to memorize a lot of passages for my civ class, as some of my professors in here are very well aware of. And I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on like, I mean, obviously back then people were a lot more in touch with literature, and like I just kind of wanted to like get what you thought about like how do you reconcile with like I guess like the importance of acting and recitation of text in an age that is not as in touch with that.
That's a great, great question. Actually, a series of questions, Mason. Thank you for that. I've never acted in Shakespeare, and I've never directed Shakespeare. You can tell, unless I've successfully masked it, which I have not, that I have a thick Brooklyn accent. And in my day, there were no Brooklyn characters in any of Shakespeare's plays, so I was never cast in junior high school, or subsequent productions of the plays. Nonetheless, there's something invaluable to be gained from committing to memory speeches. Now, Lincoln had a prodigious memory, I mean, extraordinary, and few of us could rival that. But I require my students, on pain of doing badly on the midterm, to memorize a sonnet and to always have that sonnet handy when they're stuck in an elevator or being lectured by somebody. They want to tune out and just recite that. It's a great comfort to have a great bit. It doesn't have to be Shakespeare. It could be Keats. It could be Lowell. It could be anybody. Emily Dickinson's poems are extraordinary to memorize. Just to have it in your head. And as you get older, watch how the meaning of that changes. You know, let's face it, we live in an age where if I forget what the lines are, there's a little thing in my pocket that's going to finish the poem for me. But there's something to be said about the synaptic quality of memorization that our ancestors took for granted that our children will not understand. Thank you, Mason. There's a question in the back, straight back.
Oh, good. Thanks, John.
Hi, my name is Matt. Do you think Booth's obsession for Shakespeare made him delusional of the world around him, where he wanted to embody like the characters he's reading, or it was like a fuel to like an anger he had towards Lincoln? One of the two. Which one do you think, or something else?
You know, I said I'm not an actor, so I can say this and not insult Aaron and others who are. But a lot of actors I know are delusional. To be a method actor is to engage in a form of self-delusion, I suppose. That may be unfair, but I've watched it, so I'm saying that. I think both things you're saying are true. Booth is looking to justify murdering President Lincoln, who was freeing the slaves and making them the equal of whites. He also labored under the fact that he wasn't as good an actor as his big brother, and that he was struggling to gain attention. There are things that I did not get into in this talk that are much more speculative about what drove John Wilkes Booth to do what he did. And I could say that I could try to get into his head, but it's not a good head to get into if you study the man. And anybody who's kind of stimulated by this talk to learn more about Edwin Booth rather than Lincoln, which I would prefer, but there are Boothies who spend their lives doing nothing but accumulating material on Edwin Booth. And they've actually put together a book tracking his life day by day from his childhood to his death, which made researching this chapter a lot easier for me. But your speculation into why he turned to Shakespeare is as good as mine. All I can do it is, in a sense, is present the evidence for it. And again, his Shakespeare is his Shakespeare. It was unique, it was popular in his own day, and it speaks to an America a century and a half ago where Shakespeare was common currency, where we all shared something other than, say, Adele's lyrics. I mean, everybody, old and young, had Shakespeare. So that is a different world. They had Shakespeare and they had the Bible. And I would say that both are fading in cultural currency right now. There's a question on the right.
Yeah, well, kind of going off of that, I guess. Well, first, thank you for speaking with us, Dr. Shapiro. But my question is,
Tell us your name.
oh, I'm Alicia.
Alicia.
So in my Civ class, we just read James Joyce's Ulysses, and in the Ithaca episode, I think that Bloom had mentioned that he was like kind of searching for answers in Shakespeare to kind of help with his situation with his cheating wife. And so I guess my question is, like, what answers do you think he was searching for in Shakespeare, and like what makes Shakespeare so perennial?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alicia. And I should say, I teach at a school with, where we have Civ courses, and it's really great visiting a school with Civ courses where there's a kind of intellectual backbone, where I'm unfortunately thrown really hard curveball questions like this. But to the best of my ability, Joyce was a great reader of Shakespeare, so there's no surprise that Shakespeare begins to shape his language and shape the thinking of his characters. I think your question is connected with several of the others so far, which is to say, for writers, for thinkers, Shakespeare becomes not weaponized, but appropriated in order to try to work through really complicated personal or ethical situations. One of the reasons why I love Shakespeare is because he did not choose sides, not even in Julius Caesar. He likes to create a situation in a way that Hegel writes about in his philosophy of art when describing how tragedy works. Not as the fall of a great man, as Aristotle had it, but as a collision of ethical imperatives that destroy those who collide. And he is not lecturing us. He's making available deep insights into human nature, which we're going to take one way or another. Joyce is a really complicated example, and I give a lot of credit to anyone who works on Joyce and Shakespeare, and some people do. I don't, because I find Joyce vexing enough as Joyce, and I can't, juggle two great chainsaws at once. But the short and long answer is Joyce is both, I suppose, showing off a little bit his knowledge of Shakespeare, which is deep, and also using that to animate the crises that his characters are working through. But that's a great question. Fire away. Your name is?
I'm Christina.
Christina.
So I have a question about
Great questions. Go ahead.
what you think about Lincoln's perspective on Shakespeare and how it changed. I know a lot of us have been lucky enough to experience Shakespeare in both a classroom and a reading setting, and then also in a performance aspect. But I know you said that Lincoln didn't really have access to the theater for a long time. So do you think his perception of Shakespeare changed at all? Well, I know he talked about it a lot.
That's a good question that I haven't thought hard enough about. If push comes to shove, I'll give you my best answer. Lincoln was a depressive. And watching 700,000 Americans in blue and gray die under your watch made a depressive person as depressed as you can be without killing yourself. Throw on top of that losing your beloved son, your wife becomes challenging, trying to hold together a feeble union at the end of his life. These made his experience of Shakespeare darker and darker. And I think the darkness that he woke up to every morning colored, shaded his readings of the play, so that by the end he's only reading dark stuff. And he needs to, in a weird way, I can read this to myself, and it's meaningful. Lincoln had to share. I think it was the only way for him to share how unbelievably depressed he was by giving voice to it through some of the most depressive, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. I remember we were bringing a production of Macbeth to prisons about 8 years ago, and the actor who was playing Macbeth had had substance abuse and alcohol problems in his life and had hit a bottom, and he had come back. But he was the most depressed actor playing Macbeth I had ever met. And he was doing the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech, and the director said to him, "You can't bring that to prison. It's just too dark. People are going to go back to their cells after that and bash their brains out. Just don't make it lively, just not that dark." And I think Lincoln's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow was that dark. Next question.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us today. My name's Claire. So you said earlier that people read Shakespeare through the prism of their own experience, and I think that you would agree that that applies to acting as well. Of course, it's very hard to separate an actor's self and experiences from their performance. So that being said, with the roles that John Wilkes Booth got to play, including, I believe you said, Macbeth and Richard III, what do records say about his acting style in comparison to others? I know these characters have both quite villainous traits, and to follow up on that, coming from an acting family, what do records of his father and his brother Edwin Booth, how did were they similar, I guess? Yeah.
Sure, I'm really happy to answer that. In the mid-19th century, actors toured. Rails made visiting far-flung cities possible in a way that had not been possible. So every small town, Cincinnati, Toledo, had its own resident stock company. 20 people who were super talented, not superstars, but super talented, who would wait for the star actor to come to town and play Hamlet or Macbeth. And they knew all the secondary parts, and you just plug in the superstar and sell out the house. So Booth would show up, and he said, let's not do the first 4 acts of Macbeth or Richard III, because we know why everybody's here. And he would get out his sword, and the poor guy playing Macduff, Leon Macduff, would get out his sword and expect, they tap back and forth 3 or 4 times. And all of a sudden, Booth's attacking him, and he's falling off the stage and holding on for dear life. So we have the recollections of these other actors. This guy's out of his mind. That was Booth's style. And that's what people love to see him do. Now, after, it's a digression. In the mid-19th century, an age of what we call manifest destiny, when under President Jackson we were kind of, let's just go from Providence to Los Angeles, wiping everything in our way out of the way, and let's go invade in a Mexican-American war and get more land and extend the reach of slavery. That was manifest destiny. And in an age of manifest destiny, men were men, and manliness was what mattered. And in that age, no man could play Romeo. They were just duds on stage. And the reason for that was, and this is a long way of answering your question, the reason for that was Romeo at certain points is literally called in the play effeminate. He weeps in the friar's cell. So sometimes he's kind of unmanly, and other times he picks up a sword and he kills Tybalt, and he kills County Paris at the end. So you had to be able to be both, if you will, masculine and feminine in that role. And no man could do it. So what happened was women started playing Romeo. And Charlotte Cushman was like the greatest Romeo of the 19th century. And for about 40 or 50 years, the only Romeo worth paying to see was a woman playing Romeo. After the Civil War, when the whole idea of being manly ran up against 700,000 dead men, it changed. And the fire went out of Manifest Destiny at that point. And women were no longer Romeo or Hamlet for the most part, although they continued to play Hamlet. Edwin Booth played a much less aggressive, manly Shakespeare than Edwin Forrest or John Wilkes Booth. He played a softer, more psychological, more thoughtful Shakespeare hero. And that was the major difference between the two of them. And for a while it looked like, oh, you're the brother of the guy who assassinated Lincoln. We don't want to see you on stage. But he was such a great actor, America forgave him, and he played the less manly roles, or in a less aggressively manly style. So what I'm really saying in answer to a very shrewd question is, if you want to know the story of America and are unhappy what you're reading in textbooks, just study a little stage history, and you'd be amazed at what these things tell you about the stuff we all know, but it's not written down that way. Next question. You go first, and then you go.
Okay. Hi. Thanks so much for the talk. This is fascinating. I was struck by, speaking of the stage history and Wilkes Booth on stage, your description of him doing work, Shakespeare sort of becoming work for him.
Yeah.
And even sort of his final lines, useless, useless, like what was it all for? Is there anything to like the way in which Lincoln and Booth read Shakespeare that was divided into different economies of reading, of leisure versus, work for production that perhaps is interesting in terms of how they processed?
It's funny when you say that. It's a great question. That Lincoln uses the word unprofessional, that he's not a professional. But a professional wasn't somebody like me, because there were no academics professing Shakespeare. There were no Shakespeare classes in 1865. The professionals were the actors. And that was how it broke down. So if you're a professional, then there's a skill set involved. And the skill set was mastering, say, a dozen roles of the plays that Americans liked to see performed. If you're an unprofessional or a non-professional like Lincoln, you get to read everything and you get to experience it in ways that didn't work for a professional. James Hackett couldn't do a particular scene from Henry IV because it didn't really work on stage. Lincoln didn't care. So a lot of this has to do with who owns Shakespeare and whether Shakespeare is owned by people who read and experience him personally and unprofessionally, or Shakespeare is owned by people like me who are invited to schools like this to pontificate about Shakespeare, or whether Shakespeare belongs to the actors, which he was himself, and the plays were written for. So there's always a little quiet under the table, elbowing and positioning going on about what constitutes. It's my work. It was Booth's work. It wasn't Lincoln's work. It was Lincoln's relief from work. But it's something for me to think about, that professionalism. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Olivia.
And if you have to leave, don't worry about it. Just root for the team you want this weekend. I won't tell you my own choice. Go ahead.
My question is, after the death of Lincoln's son, Willie, why do you think he chose to do that Constance monologue from King John as opposed to the Macduff monologue from Act 4 of Macbeth? Because, as you said, like, his wife became more challenging and he was facing the impending war. I feel like the Macduff monologue would have fit his situation so much better. So why instead do you think that he turned to Constance and King John?
You know, I have this image of you asking him that question and him reciting it for the next 4 hours back at you in a kind of funny, you should suggest that way. I don't think they were mutually exclusive for him, but I think that at that moment, the kind of loss of a child passage was the King John passage, and it just cut through him like a knife. But I am sure before he put his head to pillow, he was also going through the lines from Macbeth. But again, I left out about a dozen examples of individuals and groups he bored to death reading Shakespeare. I mean, if he wasn't like one of the greatest presidents of the United States, you would consider him one of the great Shakespeare bores in history. But that's a separate way of thinking about all this. Time for one more question on the right. Yeah, you do, because it's recorded. I'm going to pass it. Go ahead.
My name is Jimmy, and you told us Lincoln's favorite Shakespeare work. What is your personal favorite?
Wow. That's like asking me which one of my kids I like the most. I only have one kid, so that's easy. But with Shakespeare, you have close to 40 plays. My answer is always the same, the play I'm working on. And right now, I'm working on a really thrilling production of Hamlet that's going to open in May at the Delacorte Theater, which is free if you line up and wait for 4 hours for a ticket, in Central Park. Try to see it. It will be memorable. Thank you. These are great, great questions. And there are some clearly great teachers at this school, so I'm grateful to each and every one of you.